We all need to make smart decisions with our money. The Long-Term Investor podcast shows you how by distilling complex financial matters into easily digestible lessons. And now, here's your host, Chief Investment Officer at PlanCorp and the author of Making Money Simple, Peter Lazaroff.
Welcome to The Long-Term Investor. Today, I'm answering listener and reader questions about 401k accounts. As a reminder, you can reply to any of my emails with your questions or visit thelongterminvestor.com to submit questions at the bottom of the page. Now let's dive in. First question, I'm 46 and have been working for the same organization for almost 25 years, one that has a defined benefit pension plan. I've also been contributing to my 401k since I started working. As I ponder retirement age, I wonder if it'd be a sound strategy to use my 401k as a means to leave my job at age 55 and bridge the gap to age 62 when the pension benefits would be unreduced. I'm concerned that using a significant portion or all of the 401k would be too risky, leaving me with only the pension. Of course, there are other factors at play, but generally speaking, I'm trying to understand and anticipate any obvious pitfalls with this approach. Here's the thing. You save into a 401k so that you have money to fund your retirement. So there is 100% nothing wrong with tapping your 401k while waiting for your pension benefits to kick in. But I suppose the real question is whether you have enough money to really be financially independent at age 55. And it sounds like you could benefit from a Monte Carlo analysis that runs thousands of scenarios on your investments and retirement cash flows, such as the pension, Social Security, etc., to calculate the likelihood you can meet your lifestyle objectives without running out of money. This is actually the very first thing we do at PlanCorp with someone, regardless of their age, because it also tends to uncover opportunities to minimize taxes and allocate capital more efficiently. I would also note that if any portion of your 401k is in a Roth, then you're probably best rolling the traditional portion of your 401k into a traditional rollover IRA and the Roth funds into a Roth IRA, because your Roth account is something you probably don't want to deplete this early in retirement. And you might also consider investing the Roth and traditional IRAs differently, which you can't really do if they're still in the 401k account. Next question. I'm an engineer and a super nerd when it comes to financial spreadsheets. I use Quicken to track spending by categories over a rolling 10-year period, and I could go on forever, but I guess one of my big questions is whether or not to shift my 401k contributions from pre-tax to Roth. Right now, everything in my 401k is 100% pre-tax, and I max it out. I'm solidly in the 22% tax bracket, regardless of the pre-tax versus Roth contribution. I also max out a Roth IRA and an HSA, which is invested as much as it can be, and I'm not reimbursing for medical expenses as of the start of 2022. By starting Roth 401k contributions, I'm locking in that 22% rate, and I completely understand that I might have some income in retirement that falls in a higher marginal tax bracket, particularly if I utilize Roth conversions. As it stands, I plan to go from 15% pre-tax to 15% Roth in April because I feel that it's good to have different levers to pull just in case. Of course, that 15% Roth will be like putting 20% pre-tax, so I'm kind of increasing 401k contributions depending on how you look at it. Thanks for the question. There's a lot to digest here. First of all, this person's savings rate is excellent. Based on the information provided, I would guess his savings rate is about 20% and maybe even a little bit higher. It also sounds like a pension is in play. So this person seems to be on track for plenty of financial freedom later in life. One of my Peterisms, as a few of my colleagues at PlanCorp call it, is that a good savings rate can offset a lifetime of poor financial decisions. So that's the good news here. Now to address the Roth versus traditional 401k. Let's level set real quickly. Both traditional and Roth 401k accounts allow your savings to grow tax-free. With the traditional 401k, you get a tax deduction on the contributions you make. That's why people like this listener refer to them as pre-tax accounts, because you're funding the account using dollars that aren't taxed as ordinary income. When you withdraw the money in retirement, you do owe ordinary income tax on any appreciation and income earned on your contributions. With a Roth 401k, you use after-tax dollars to fund the account. So if you have a $10,000 paycheck and you're at the 22% tax bracket, as this listener is, then you will have $7,800 from your paycheck to invest. Or said another way, if you want to contribute $10,000 to a Roth 401k, you have to earn about $12,820 to have $10,000 left after paying ordinary income tax. I have a lot of tax bracket numbers and contribution limits that I can link to in the show notes, so be sure to check that out and see where you fall, because there's lots of math here. But the important thing to know is that if you contribute after-tax dollars to a Roth, they grow tax-free, but then you make withdrawals 100% tax-free. So that's a really big deal in retirement. The only way to answer the question of traditional versus Roth 401k is knowing what tax law will be in the future and where you fall within that tax law. If you knew that your bracket was going to be higher in retirement than it is today, then using a Roth today is undoubtedly the better choice. Similarly, if you knew that your tax bracket will be lower in retirement than it is today, then using a traditional 401k will be better. Of course, this dynamic is going to change over time. For example, imagine you only save to Roth accounts for the first 2 decades of your career. If you continue only contributing to Roth accounts, you're setting yourself up to have a lower tax bracket in retirement because withdrawals from Roth accounts are completely tax-free. My general feeling is that anyone in their 20s and early 30s should use Roth accounts whenever possible because you have enough time for the compounding to really work in your favor. But somewhere in your late 30s or early 40s, the math gets a little fuzzier and the Roth is a less obvious choice. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. It just means that personal circumstances begin to really drive that decision. And by the time you're in your 50s and 60s, how much you've accumulated in the different accounts begins to drive the decision as you have a little better visibility on what your tax situation in retirement might be. If you're uncertain of whether to use a Roth or traditional, you can also split your contributions between the two, which is a strategy referred to as tax diversification. There's some people who recommend doing this split right out the gate because there's no guarantee that the rules on Roth accounts won't change. And 30 years from now, I think there's a reasonable chance that Roth accounts with a large amount of assets could be subject to different rules than what is the case today. I have another post on the choice between traditional and Roth that I'll be sure to link to in the show notes at thelongterminvestor.com. And one final small note is that this person suggests that they'll be doing Roth conversions in retirement. And this is a great strategy for new retirees, but it does sound like legislation coming out of Washington may put an end to this strategy, so keep an eye out for that. Last question I have. I'm 39 years old and have been maxing out my 401k my entire career while using a target date retirement fund. I just changed jobs, and my new employer also has target date funds, but far more additional options than my previous employer. Is there a rule of thumb for knowing when to use a target date fund over other options? If I decide to use the other fund options, are there any best practices for selecting the right ones? Great question. So target date funds give you a mix of stocks and bonds based on when you are thinking you're going to need the money. So they start with an aggressive mix of stocks and bonds and gradually become more conservative as you approach the target date. I feel like target date funds are generally an effective option if you don't have anyone helping you choose the right mix of investments. If you have an advisor, though, you should certainly show him or her the options and have them help make the determination for you. Even if you have a friend that's an advisor, you might consider asking them to take a quick look. For the clients we work with at PlanCorp, we typically build them a custom allocation if the options are good enough, something I'll touch on more in just a moment. But I feel like the type of person we work with, target date funds are fine for people who are multiple decades away from retirement because the typical mix of stocks and bonds is appropriately aggressive. But for people less than 20 years from retirement, the degree to which these funds become more conservative doesn't always seem optimal. Of course, as you're within 20 years or so from retirement, you really ought to have a financial advisor at that point. So this would just be one of another of the services that they would help you with. Now, as for picking other funds, it's really hard to make broad statements on how to pick the best funds since every 401k plan's offerings are so different. But I do think I can share a few general thoughts that are useful. First, you're better off choosing funds with the lowest cost. There is very robust research that shows fund costs and fund performance are closely related. So low cost should be your primary focus within a 401k plan. Secondly, I'd suggest that where possible, you choose index funds over actively managed funds. Over all the episodes that I've done for this podcast, I feel like many times I've referred to S&P's Index versus Active Scorecard, or SPIVA scorecard, which is updated twice a year. This scorecard compares active managers to their respective index benchmark over 1, 3, 5, 10, and 20-year periods. And across all time periods and asset classes, the vast majority of active managers fail to beat a simple benchmark. And I'll drop a table as well as a link to this latest SPIVA scorecard. And even just taking a quick glance at now, when I look at the 20-year periods, generally speaking, 90% or more of managers fail to beat their benchmark. 20 years is a long time. It's very hard to be consistently smarter than everybody else, which is basically what you're asking an active manager to do. But even as you look at these 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, and 10-year results, you'll be surprised to see that 70, 80, maybe sometimes 90% of managers fail to beat their benchmarks in these time periods as well. Now, most 401k fund lineups will show you past performance over 1, 3, 5, and sometimes 10-year periods. It can be tempting to choose actively managed funds that have the highest performance, but the S&P Persistence Scorecard shows that funds in the top quartile of performers over any given 3 and 5 year period tend to lag in the following 3 and 5 year periods. Again, I'll put links to both SPIVA, the S&P Index versus Active, and the S&P Persistence Scorecards in the show notes at thelongterminvestor.com. It would be very unusual that a 401k plan these days doesn't offer low-cost index funds. There were a lot of lawsuits on large 401k plans a little more than a decade ago that prompted changes across the industry such that you can pretty much always count on them being an option in your plan. A final thing to keep in mind is to make sure you're appropriately diversified. I offer up some different asset allocations in my book, and I'll include that table in the show notes as well, just to give you a sense of how much to allocate to US and international stocks versus bonds and cash. That's all I have for this episode. Thanks again for submitting the questions. I'll be sure to do another one of these episodes sometime in the next month or two, but I am really excited for some of the guest interviews coming up over the next several weeks, so be sure to subscribe to the show so that you don't miss any of them. Until next time, to long-term investing.
Thanks for listening to the Long-Term Investor Podcast. To access free financial resources and submit questions to be answered on the show, visit thelongterminvestor.com. Peter Lazaroff is an employee of PlanCorp and BrightPlan. All opinions expressed by Peter and any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of PlanCorp or BrightPlan. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of PlanCorp and BrightPlan may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.